I'm Blake Lehman. I'm 17 years old. I was sentenced to 55 years for murder.
I'm Jesus Macedo Perez. I'm 17 years old, and I got sentenced to 65 years for murder.
He was only 13 years old. No weapon, no injuries, no history of violence. Yet, when police officers arrested him for stealing a pair of sneakers, he was cuffed, hauled away in a squad car, and locked in a concrete cell for weeks. No one called his mom, no lawyer showed up, and while he cried through the night, across the hall another boy, just 15, was smashing his head against a wall, screaming for help. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the system working exactly how it was designed to. Because in America, if you're young, poor, and in trouble, what happens next depends less on what you did and more on where you are, what you look like, and whether the system thinks you're worth saving. And to understand how this machine got built and why it keeps grinding up kids, we've got to go back nearly 2 centuries. The origins, where it all began. In 1825, a group of wealthy New Yorkers created the first institution specifically for juvenile offenders. It was called the House of Refuge. On the surface, it was a noble idea. Keep children out of adult jails, teach them discipline, and mold them into productive citizens. But behind the gates, the truth was darker. These early institutions were run like factories. Kids were subjected to hard labor, strict silence rules, and military-style punishments. Many weren't even charged with crimes. Some were just homeless or unruly. The system treated poverty as a criminal offense. This early model laid the blueprint. Treat misbehavior with confinement, discipline, and correction, not care, therapy, or second chances. But what began as a social experiment would soon become a national obsession, and the next wave of reform would change everything, or at least promise to. The progressive era. Hope meets reality. By the late 1800s, the child-saving movement was in full swing. Reformers believed children were different from adults, more moldable, less accountable. So instead of punishing kids like criminals, they proposed training schools with education, moral lessons, and even religious guidance. In theory, it sounded like progress. In reality, many of these facilities were overcrowded, unsanitary, and dangerous. Reports emerged of children being beaten, sexually abused, or placed in solitary confinement for days. Girls were often detained for immorality, sometimes just for being pregnant or staying out past curfew. Despite the rhetoric of rehabilitation, the facility still looked and felt like prisons. Barred windows, isolation rooms, uniforms, guards. But even that wasn't the most disturbing part, because as we'll see next, who ended up in these places was never random. Race, class, and the hidden rules. From the beginning, juvenile justice in America has been a story of inequality. Black and brown kids are far more likely to be arrested, detained, and given longer sentences than white kids, even when charged with the same crimes. A white teenager caught shoplifting might get a stern lecture. A black teenager might be taken away in handcuffs. Why? Because rehabilitation has always depended on the assumption that the child is worth rehabilitating. For white middle-class boys, reform was possible. For kids of color, especially in urban areas, the system often saw them as hardened criminals in the making. In the 20th century, this bias became more entrenched through so-called tough-on-crime policies, and no era shows that shift more clearly than the 1990s. The super predator era, panic over evidence. In the early 90s, a new term exploded in the media, super predator. Academics, politicians, and journalists warned of a coming wave of violent youth with no conscience, no empathy. They were portrayed as monsters, not children. That fear wasn't based on facts. Juvenile crime was already declining, but that didn't matter. Laws changed, judges got harsher, police cracked down on schools, more kids were tried as adults, and juvenile facilities became more like prisons than ever before.
The United States far outpaces other countries in detaining and otherwise criminalizing young people. And that has, again, similar to the adult system, a disparate impact on youth of color who are disproportionately represented in contact with the criminal justice system.
At the turn of the 19th century, we created the world's first juvenile justice system. The idea behind that was that as a society, we had a moral obligation to recognize the developmental differences of children as compared to adults.
One Florida boy, just 12 years old, was charged as an adult for killing a toddler. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But the fallout from this era wasn't just about punishment. It revealed something else, a core flaw in how the system treated kids. Because once you enter it, there's rarely a clean way out. Aging out from juvenile to adult prison. What happens when a juvenile turns 18 while still in detention? In many states, they're transferred straight into adult prison without any special preparation or support. Imagine spending your teen years in a juvenile facility, then waking up one morning to a new reality. Cellmates twice your size, guards trained for maximum security, and a culture of violence you've never known. Even worse, many of these youth entered detention for non-violent crimes or minor offenses. But once inside, their lives spiral. Education is disrupted. Mental health deteriorates. And by the time they're released, they're often more traumatized than before. And the numbers paint a grim picture. Youth who serve time in detention are more likely to end up incarcerated again as adults. But not every story ends in failure. Glimmers of reform. What's working now? Despite its many failures, the juvenile system isn't beyond saving. Some states are moving away from detention and toward community-based alternatives, programs that focus on mentorship, therapy, and restorative justice. These approaches reduce reoffending and actually help kids rebuild their lives. Places like Missouri have pioneered small group homes instead of prison-like institutions. In these programs, staff members act more like counselors than guards. Kids attend real schools. They receive therapy. They're treated like people. Other reforms include eliminating solitary confinement for minors, ending mandatory transfer to adult court, and sealing juvenile records to give young people a fresh start. Still, for every reform effort, there are pushbacks. Budgets get slashed, political winds shift, and sometimes it only takes one high-profile crime to erase years of progress. But there's one truth the system keeps learning, sometimes the hard way. Conclusion: where do we go from here? Every kid who ends up in juvenile detention carries a story of mistakes, pain, trauma, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The real question isn't whether kids mess up, it's how we respond when they do. Do we lock them away and hope they come out better? Or do we actually do the hard work of guiding, mentoring, and understanding them? Because the truth is, the juvenile system doesn't just shape individual lives. It tells us what kind of society we are and what kind we want to be. And while the answers aren't simple, one thing is clear: the way we treat our youngest, even at their worst, reveals the heart of our justice.